This happened 4 years ago, so the sting is gone and my revenge has been had. We dated for 4 years and had what I thought was a great relationship. We were both well-established professionals who both owned homes in the same neighborhood, both with daughters in the home. Her daughter was 11, and mine was 16 when we met. I thought I'd found something special, something worth building a life around. We had actually planned to get married, build a house, and raise the 2 girls together. We planned the house build because Sarah had recently been diagnosed with a neurological disease that would eventually put her in a wheelchair, and we needed something accessible and friendly for her future needs. During the planning stages, I began doing landscape and construction projects on her home to increase the resale value. This was my area of expertise, after all. All in, I invested roughly $30,000 into the home, running everything through my side construction business for tax, permitting, and resale purposes. We had a contract that payment would be made upon the sale of the home. I produced invoices for each and every project, keeping everything professional and documented. But I never pushed for payment because of our prior agreement and our relationship. I trusted her completely. Fast forward 6 months, and we were looking at property to develop and finalizing drawings on the home when I began feeling ill. I couldn't eat, was constantly vomiting and passing blood. I began noticing that my abdomen looked swollen, which was odd because we were both very clean eaters and were in the gym every day. The swelling concerned me enough that I went to the doctor and began having tests done. Meanwhile, Sarah began having small cognitive issues related to her condition. The stress of her current position was exacerbating her condition, so she took a $20,000 per year cut in pay, along with a lesser position inside the company. It was a difficult decision for her, but necessary for her health. After a month or so of different tests and a biopsy, the results came back. I had a golf ball-sized tumor in my stomach and would need to begin chemotherapy immediately. The news hit me like a freight train. I'd lost my wife to illness years ago, when my children were 1 and 3. And now I was facing my own mortality. So I began chemo and radiation treatments, which made me, as expected, extremely ill. The nausea, the weakness, the constant fatigue, it was overwhelming. Sarah was spending time helping around my place on the weekends and staying over more, to the point that she and her daughter were both at my home more than theirs. At this point, I suggested that we go ahead and put one of our houses on the market and move in together until the new house was built. I had great supplemental insurance as well as a long-term illness plan. So using that, coupled with the sale of one of our houses, would push us through comfortably and help ease the financial stress on her. It seemed like the logical next step. We were planning to get married anyway, and my illness had simply accelerated our timeline. I thought she'd be relieved at the suggestion. Shortly after this discussion, however, Sarah became extremely distant. Her daughter wasn't coming down and hanging out with mine anymore. She had excuses for not getting together. She quit driving me to treatments and stopped staying over. I tried to understand, tried to give her space, thinking maybe she was overwhelmed with everything happening. Then she dropped a bomb on me, a sentence that will forever be burned into my psyche. I love you, but I can't see myself taking care of someone this sick in the long term, and I don't think we should see each other any longer. She sent this in a text message, not a phone call, not in person, a text. It broke me. I won't lie. This was the first woman I had ever opened up to and planned a life with since my wife died. I had been vulnerable with her in ways I hadn't been with anyone in over a decade. However, I tried to be mature about it. I forced myself to understand her position and to accept what I could not change. Maybe the stress of her own condition combined with watching me go through chemo was too much. Maybe she was scared. I tried to rationalize it in every way possible to avoid feeling the crushing weight of abandonment. I calmly, the next day, gathered all of her things and packed them neatly. I loaded them in my truck and took them to her house to leave on the back porch while she was at work, in order to avoid any awkward exchanges. I didn't want a confrontation. I just wanted to close this chapter as cleanly as possible and focus on surviving my treatment. Walking around the back and under the porch cover, I sat down a box and happened to glance through the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was Sarah in her back living room, on the couch, having sex with a man that she had introduced to me as a lifelong friend. His name was Trevor. I had dinner and drinks with this man and his girlfriend multiple times. We had gone on vacation with them as a couple. My hands started shaking as I stood there frozen, watching this betrayal unfold through her window. I never spoke of the incident with her. I couldn't bear to. I simply sent her a text later, explaining that I would leave her things on my side porch to pick up at her convenience. I didn't mention what I'd seen. Part of me wondered if I'd imagined it, if the chemo drugs were making me hallucinate. But I knew better. I discovered, 8 or 9 months later, from Trevor's now ex-girlfriend, Elena, that they had broken up due to him confessing that he had been sleeping with Sarah. The affair dated back to about the time we were finishing drawings on the new home. So Sarah hadn't left me because she couldn't handle my illness. She'd left me because she'd already moved on to someone else. The cancer diagnosis had just been a convenient excuse. Now I was pissed. Really, truly pissed. All that time I'd spent trying to understand her position, trying to be mature and accepting. It had all been wasted empathy for someone who didn't deserve it. At this point, I had finished chemo and radiation for the time being and was feeling healthier. The tumor had responded well to treatment, and I was in remission. I was going through some much-neglected paperwork when I ran across the file that contained $32,680 in unpaid, long-overdue invoices. Every single project I'd done on Sarah's house was documented. Every material cost, every labor hour, every permit fee, all of it meticulously recorded and invoiced through my legitimate construction business. The invoices were promptly sent to my attorney to begin lien proceedings on the home. It turns out that I couldn't have done this a moment too soon because Sarah was set to put her house on the market. My attorney filed the lien immediately, which would prevent the sale from going through until the debt was satisfied. Coupled with interest over the course of what was then 19 months overdue, the invoices were hefty. That, along with the agreement of settling them when the house was sold and attorney fees, left her with roughly $10,000 after the sale of the home and settling her current mortgage. She had been expecting to walk away with probably $60,000 or $70,000 in equity. Instead, she got $10,000. She promptly had to back out of the purchase of another home she'd been trying to buy. Without the expected equity from her house sale, she couldn't afford the down payment on the new place. She also had to leave her job around this time and begin receiving disability as her condition had progressed. She moved in with her oldest daughter, son-in-law, and 2 grandchildren. From what I heard through mutual acquaintances, the living situation was cramped and stressful for everyone involved. I ran into her a little over a year ago, and she looked as if she had aged 20 years. She was in the wheelchair we had once talked about designing a house around. The disease had progressed faster than her doctors had anticipated. We chatted cordially but briefly, and I excused myself and went on with my day. Seeing her like that stirred up complicated emotions. Part of me felt vindicated. Part of me felt sad for what could have been. Mostly, I just felt numb. A few days later, her younger daughter, Emily, called me. She spoke of my running into her mom and asked if we could hang out sometime. Emily had been close to my daughter during our relationship, and I genuinely cared about her. I gave a vague answer, thanked her for calling, and again went on with my day. I didn't want to be cruel to Emily, but I also couldn't maintain a relationship with Sarah's family. Sarah then called me a week or so later and began apologizing for leaving me as she did. Her voice sounded smaller, more vulnerable than I remembered. Again, I was cordial but short. I thanked her for calling and hung up. She began texting after that, and this went on for several weeks. At first, the texts were apologetic and reflective. Then they became more personal, reminiscing about good times we'd shared. I kept my responses brief and non-committal. Then, one day she asked if I could ever see us rekindling what we had. That's when I knew it was time to end this definitively. She wanted back in now that I was healthy and she was struggling. Now that her affair with Trevor had apparently ended and she was alone. Now that she needed someone to help care for her as her disease progressed. The audacity of it infuriated me. I replied with her own words thrown back at her. "I can't see myself taking care of someone so sick in the long term." Then I added, "Remember the box on your back porch? Did you think that Trevor brought that over to you from my house? Good luck to you. Goodbye." I blocked her number after that. I didn't need closure or explanation or anything else from her. That message was my closure. Sometimes I feel guilt over this, but not much and not often. Looking back on the entire experience, I can see clearly how calculated her abandonment had been. She hadn't left me because my cancer was too much to handle. She'd left me because she'd already chosen someone else and needed an excuse that would make her look sympathetic rather than cruel. The timing of her departure, right after I'd suggested we sell one of our houses and move in together, made sense now. She'd realized that my suggestion would have made the affair much harder to maintain. Living together full-time would have made her secret relationship with Trevor nearly impossible to hide. So she'd ended things, using my cancer as the excuse, banking on the fact that I'd be too devastated and too sick to question her reasoning. What she hadn't counted on was me seeing her with Trevor that day. She'd thought she could walk away clean, collect the $30,000 worth of improvements I'd made to her home, and start fresh with her new relationship. Instead, she'd lost the equity she'd been counting on, lost her new home purchase, lost her independence, and ended up exactly where she'd claimed she didn't want to be. Taking care of someone sick, except now it was herself, and she was doing it in her daughter's crowded house. The karma of it all was almost poetic. I'd like to say I planned this revenge from the beginning, but I didn't. For months after the breakup, I was too sick and too heartbroken to think about revenge. I was just trying to survive my treatment and be there for my daughters. The invoices had been sitting in my files, unpaid, but not forgotten. When I finally went through my paperwork during recovery and found them, it felt like the universe was handing me an opportunity. My attorney had been straightforward about my rights. I had a legitimate business, legitimate invoices, and a legitimate contract. The work had been done, the materials had been purchased, and payment had been agreed upon. The fact that we'd been in a relationship didn't negate the business arrangement. If anything, Sarah should have been more careful about honoring the agreement precisely because of our personal relationship. The lien was perfectly legal and entirely justified. What made it particularly satisfying was that I hadn't had to do anything unethical or illegal. I hadn't lied or manipulated or sabotaged. I'd simply enforced a contract that she'd signed and agreed to. She'd been the one to break our personal commitment. She'd been the one to betray my trust. She'd been the one to abandon me during the most vulnerable time in my life. All I'd done was ensure I was paid for work I'd legitimately performed. The fact that this payment demolished her financial plans was simply a consequence of her own choices. She could have paid those invoices at any point during our relationship. She could have made payment arrangements after the breakup. She could have been honest about the affair and worked with me to settle the debt before putting her house on the market. Instead, she'd apparently thought I'd just forget about $30,000 or let it go out of kindness. My daughters had complicated feelings about the whole situation. My older daughter, who was 20 when Sarah and I broke up, was furious on my behalf. She'd never particularly liked Sarah, I learned later, and had been putting on a polite face for my sake. When she learned about the affair and the text message breakup, she wanted me to do far worse than file a lien. My younger daughter, who was 13 when we started dating and 17 when we broke up, had been closer to Sarah's daughter Emily. She was sad about losing that friendship and sad about how everything had ended. But even she understood why I'd done what I did. "You did work on her house, Dad," she'd said. "You should get paid for it." The simplicity of that statement had struck me. From a teenager's perspective, it was just that simple. You do work, you get paid. The rest was just drama. Trevor and Sarah's relationship apparently didn't last long. According to Alina, who I'd stayed in touch with because she'd been the innocent party in all this too, the affair had burned hot and fast during the excitement of sneaking around. Once it was out in the open and they tried to build an actual relationship, reality set in. Trevor wasn't prepared to deal with Sarah's declining health. The same condition that she'd claimed made her unable to care for me became the thing that drove Trevor away from her. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Elena told me that Trevor had eventually tried to reconcile with her, claiming Sarah had seduced him and he'd made a mistake. Elena, to her credit, had told him exactly where he could go. She'd moved on, started dating someone new, and was apparently much happier. I'd started dating again about 2 years after the breakup and my recovery. It had been slow and cautious. My trust in people, especially in romantic partners, had been badly damaged. I went on dates that went nowhere. I met women who seemed nice, but something always felt off. I think I was comparing everyone to an idealized version of what I'd thought Sarah was before I knew the truth. Eventually, I met Catherine at a charity fundraiser. She was a nurse who'd lost her husband to cancer 5 years earlier. We understood each other's scars and fears in a way that felt natural. We took things incredibly slowly. But here we are now, talking about moving in together. My daughters like her, which matters enormously to me. This time, though, there are no construction projects on her house, no mixing of finances, no joint anything until we're married. I'd learned that lesson painfully well. When Emily called me that day asking if we could hang out, I'd genuinely been torn. She'd been a good kid, and none of this was her fault. She'd been 11 when her mom and I started dating, 15 when we broke up. I'd watched her grow during those years, helped her with homework, taught her to ride a bike without training wheels, taken her and my daughter to movies and amusement parks. But maintaining a relationship with her meant maintaining some connection to Sarah, and I couldn't do that. It wasn't fair to Emily, but it was necessary for my own healing. I wondered sometimes if Sarah had put her up to calling me, or if Emily had done it on her own. Either way, I couldn't be the father figure in her life anymore. I hoped she understood, or would understand someday, that sometimes adults have to make hard choices about boundaries and self-preservation. The texts from Sarah, before I finally blocked her, had been increasingly desperate. She'd started with apologies, moved to reminiscing about good times, then progressed to suggesting we could try again. She'd said she'd made a mistake, that she'd been scared and overwhelmed, that she still loved me. Not once did she acknowledge the affair. She acted as if she'd simply broken up with me due to being unable to handle my illness, as if I didn't know the truth. That willingness to gaslight me, to continue lying even when trying to get back together, told me everything I needed to know about her character. When she finally asked directly if we could rekindle things, I'd sat on my response for a full day before sending it. I wanted to make sure I said exactly what I needed to say, in exactly the right way. The response I sent was perfect, short, devastating, and true. After I sent that final text and blocked her number, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. For years, I'd carried the pain of her abandonment, the confusion about why she'd left, the self-doubt about whether I'd been too much of a burden. Learning about the affair had shifted the pain but hadn't eliminated it. Confronting her in that final text, throwing her own words back at her, letting her know that I knew about Trevor, that had been the closure I needed. I didn't need her apology, or her explanation, or her justification. I just needed her to know that I knew that I wasn't fooled, and that there was no coming back from what she'd done. Some betrayals are simply too deep to forgive, and abandoning someone during cancer treatment while cheating on them definitely qualifies. I didn't wish her harm, but I didn't wish her well either. I simply wished her gone from my life. My cancer remains in remission, which my doctors are cautiously optimistic about. I go for regular checkups and scans, and so far, everything looks good. The experience of going through chemo and radiation while dealing with a breakup and betrayal had been the darkest period of my life. Darker even than losing my wife, because at least then I'd had no choice in the matter. Death is something that happens to us, but Sarah had chosen to leave. She'd chosen to betray me. She'd chosen to abandon me when I needed her most. That choice had cut deeper than any tumor ever could. But I'd survived it. I'd survived the cancer and the heartbreak, and I'd come out stronger on the other side. My relationship with my daughters had deepened through the experience. They'd seen me at my lowest and had been there for me in ways I'd never forget. My older daughter had moved back home temporarily during the worst of my treatment to help care for me. My younger daughter, despite being a teenager dealing with her own life, had stepped up in ways that amazed me. They'd both been heartbroken about Sarah's betrayal on my behalf, which had been touching even as I'd tried to shield them from the worst of it. The $30,000 I'd recovered from the lien had been put toward my medical bills and into college funds for my daughters. It felt right using that money for my family, for the people who'd actually been there for me. Sarah had thought she was clever, getting free renovations on her home and then walking away before having to pay. Instead, she'd lost not just the cost of the work, but the equity she'd been counting on for her future. She'd gambled that I'd be too sick, too heartbroken, or too dead to collect on those invoices. She'd gambled wrong. I'd lived, I'd recovered, and I'd remembered. Every single invoice, every single dollar owed. Looking back now, 4 years later, I can see the whole experience with more clarity. Sarah had probably started pulling away from me emotionally long before the breakup, maybe as soon as Trevor came back into her life. The cancer diagnosis had simply accelerated a departure that was already in motion. If I hadn't gotten sick, she probably would have found some other reason to end things. The disease had just been convenient timing, a built-in excuse that made her look sympathetic. Poor Sarah couldn't handle watching her boyfriend go through chemo. What a burden he must have been. Except I hadn't been a burden. I'd had insurance, family support, and the financial means to handle my treatment. What I'd needed from her was just basic presence and emotional support. She couldn't even give me that, because she was too busy sleeping with Trevor. The thing that bothered me most, looking back, wasn't even the affair itself. It was the cruelty of the timing and the method. She could have been honest. She could have told me she'd fallen for someone else. She could have ended things in person, with honesty and respect for what we'd built together. Instead, she'd used my cancer as an excuse and had broken up with me via text message. That cowardice, that calculated cruelty, was what I couldn't forgive. The affair was a betrayal, but the way she'd executed the breakup was something worse. So when people asked if I felt guilty about the lien, about taking most of her home equity, about forcing her to move in with her daughter, my answer was always the same. No, I didn't feel guilty. I felt satisfied. She'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. She chose to leave me during cancer, to cheat on me, to try to skip out on paying for work I'd done. I chose to enforce a legal contract and collect money I was owed. If that choice had devastating financial consequences for her, well, that was just karma working itself out. And that final text, throwing her own words back at her, that was just the cherry on top of a revenge sundae 4 years in the making. Sometimes the best revenge is just holding someone accountable for their own actions. Sarah had learned that lesson the hard way.